All right. All righty, everybody. Welcome to our April meeting. I don't know about you guys, but 7:30 creeped up on me really, really fast. It's the last hour and a half just kind of flew by. Welcome to everybody joining us via YouTube. And this is giving me an issue here. There we go. All righty. So as always, we have a couple of announcements before we get started with our main event. Just two things this time around. So first and foremost, we have on Saturday, April 27th, so this coming Saturday, we will be having a field trip. It's going to be two different locations. One is Coral Reef Park in Palmetto Bay, and the other is going to be Coral Pine Park, which is just down the road right here in Pinecrest. The field trip's gonna run from 9 a.m. to 11:30, and it's also going to be co-led by Alex C. Schultz from the Institute for Regional Conservation and our very own Steve Woodmansey. So definitely a cool trip to attend if you guys have time. Next on Tuesday, May 28th, we'll have our next monthly meeting right here in the same room at Pinecrest Gardens. We will have Cliff Martin, PhD, Botanical Curator at U.S. Tropical Research and Educational Center, or TREC. The topic is still to be determined, so stay tuned and keep track on the calendar as well as the upcoming newsletter. That same day, May 28th, is also going to be the date of our annual meeting. So this is, of course, the meeting that we hold our board elections. So if you are interested in joining the board and helping with and putting in your leadership skills into it, feel free to nominate either yourself or, with permission, somebody who you think would be a good fit. You can send nominations to our email, which is datefmps@gmail.com. I'd like to take a moment to welcome a few of our new members. Welcome to the chapter, Matthew Abbes, Maria Botegui, Cara Giordano, Natalia Herrera, Jonas Nash, and Carlos Somoza. Any of those individuals here with us? Well, hopefully they're joining us via YouTube. Either way, a big welcome to the Dade Chapter Native Plant Society. I'd like to give a quick thank you to everybody who donated plants to our raffle table. We have a couple of interesting items, including what might be the largest plant pot that I've seen on the raffle table since I started. That's a really nice one. I like it. Just a word on housekeeping, just out of courtesy to our presenter, please kindly turn off your cell phones or put them on silent. And if you'd like to read more on upcoming events and articles, there's a lot more contained in the newsletter. Also a lot more on our website. And I also would like to point out and encourage you guys to check out our brand new plant store, which is store.dade.fmpschapters.org. A lot of really cool plants that are up for sale there. All right. So we have our raffle table presentation. I wasn't sure if Raul is Raul here? Did he step out to go park his car? All right, Steve, would you like to have a word on the plants? Sorry for the impromptu. Oh, hey, Raul. Would you like to, Steve, either one, for the raffle? Much appreciated, Steve. You can just hold this up.
All right, so have an awesome selection here, thanks to Dr. Raul Moas, who's donated a lot of plants. And of course, if you don't win any of these plants, you can buy them on our online store. So you can come to me or Raul afterward for the details. How's our inventory online right now? Yeah, so that sounds great. And most of his stuff are from our globally imperiled plant community called Pine Rockland. So if you want to boost up your species diversity, Raoul grows a lot of unusual wildflowers and plants. He even sometimes has one of the native milkweeds. And if you didn't know, we now have an online store. You can get to the link from our website, dadefnps.org, and you can buy directly from there. All right, so that's enough of that commercial. We'll talk about these plants. And before we do, I just want to point out you can own a piece of history. So this pot, we used it as a display here at the garden that went defunct. So we used to have plants in it, but the plants are long been donated, but we still had the pot. So you can own a little bit of day chapter history by putting in your raffle tickets for this pot. And it's light, it's plastic, it's not concrete. All right, so we got some nice natives. Here's a nice selection of one of our native grasses. It's almost like a shrub. This is called wild bamboo. It's not a true bamboo. The genus is Lysiasis. It's Lysiasis divaricata, and it grows in light gaps of hammocks. This will grow and tolerate a lot of shade. What's nice about this grass is it has seeds that attract buntings. Buntings like to eat grass seed. So if you want to attract buntings, which is a kind of bird, a colorful bird is the painted bunting, then you'll want to have some native grasses in your yard. We also have some pine rockland plants. Here's a little baby quailberry, which is a low-growing ground cover. It's a cephruescent herb. Cephruescent means woody in botanical jargon. And the leaves look like holly, although it's not related to holly. It's in the Celestraceae, which is a tropical plant family. Does not have showy flowers, but has red fruits that probably used to attract the native bob whites that used to be all around here when I was a kid. Now they're pretty much restricted to Everglades National Park. We also have this lovely pine rockland wildflower that grows on the edge between prairie and pine rockland. It's in the Acanthaceae, which is the petunia family. This one's called pinklet, Stenandrium dulce. It's a low-growing wildflower with real pretty pink flowers, forms these little basal rosettes, and will spread around your little pineland area. We have a large selection of our native state wildflower here. This is a tickseed. Most of it looks like Coreopsis, leavenworthii, although some of it looks weird. And that's an annual wildflower. That's our state wildflower, and adds a lot of color this time of year to your yard. We have, that's interesting. So this is called cinchweed or T. blinkum. This is Pectus glaucescens, and it's very aromatic. It kind of smells like dill to me. I don't know if you can use it culinarily though. It's in the Asteraceae, which is a sunflower family, same family as a tickseed, and it'll have little tiny yellow flowers. But like almost all members of the Asteraceae, they're great for attracting pollinators like bees and butterflies. Here we have some of Raoul's selections. He brought in a nice state endangered Ipomoea tenuissima, which, gosh, what's the common name of this one? Pine Rockland morning glory. Well, that's clever. It occurs in pine rocklands in extreme South Florida. We also have, this is your Desmodium marylandicum, which is a native member of the pea family. This will get about this tall, has pink flowers. Actually, that'd be pretty tall. They're usually about that tall. And it's a perennial underground. So it kind of dies back in the winter and then should come back. We also have a native partridge pea. And this one is fasciculata, which is what I call the annual partridge pea. It's also a legume, but it's in a different subfamily. The Desmodium has pea-shaped flowers. This one has flowers that kind of look like oncidium or orchid flowers, the kinds you'd see in cassia or senna or Hong Kong orchid trees. They have those 5 petals. Chamacristas are also host plants for some butterflies. You'll want to look those up. This one is a semi-annual, can grow maybe up to 2 years. It gets about this tall, gets covered in yellow flowers. It's generally easy, if you let them get pollinated, you can collect the seed when the fruits are brown and dry, and they generally germinate fairly readily. Okay. Wow. It's an unusual grass. I'm glad Raoul's growing it. This is Eleonoris tripsicoides. It's got a horrible common name. Pan American balsam scale. What's interesting, I learned how to identify this in the field because it just looks like a grass. But I'm not going to do this now. But when they're larger, if you pull up a piece of the base and you chew on it, it'll numb your mouth a little bit. So most grasses are not toxic, though. I'm telling you, you can trust me. So although some of them will itch. This one is a nice bunch grass that you see in pinelands and flatwoods of Florida. I mentioned some of the native milkweeds he grows. Here's our swamp, one of the ones called swamp milkweed. This is Asclepias incarnata. If you're going to grow this, you may want a water feature, or you'd have to keep it in like a saucer of water. This grows in swamps, hence the name. We have silver aster, Symphytrichum concolor, real pretty pinkish lavender flowers. This is another perennial underground one. So it kind of dies back in the winter, but it comes back in the spring and summer. We have a nice native Melanthera parvifolia. The common name is black anthers. It's also called cat's tongue because if you feel the leaves, it's very rough. This is in the Asteraceae, attracts a ton of pollinators. It has white flowers with black anthers, hence the name Melanthera, which is Latin for black anthers. This one is found in pine rockland, and it should grow kind of along the ground. It shouldn't get as tall as the coastal one. And he has another native pine rockland grass. This is a Schizochyrium gracili. It's already in fruit. You can see the little tufts there. Those are the seeds. And this is an important grass that's in pinelands. We have Stylosanthes hamata, which is cheesy toes. It's also called pencil flowers, has real pretty yellow flowers, kind of a lawn weed, not really a pine rockland plant, but it's the host plant for the dainty sulfur? No, one of the butterflies. You remember, Mary? Is it dainty or is it the? It's the barred yellow. Oh, here's a really nice one. This will have yellow flowers too, but this is in the St. John's wort family. This is Hypericum hypericoides, and they call it St. Andrew's cross. It has 4 petals. I don't know if they use this medicinally. It's not the same one that you get the supplement for. It's a European species, but this is a real nice subshrub or wildflower. He also has here silkgrass, which is actually in the Asteraceae. One of my favorite wildflowers. You could actually, this is a beautiful spray of yellow flowers, and you can even cut these and put them in a vase, and they'll last on your countertop for weeks. So this is one of the native wildflowers that you can actually use in decoration. We have another, remember the Asteraceae. This will have similar to the silky aster. This is called clasping aster, and the leaves become much reduced as they go up the stem. And it's have purple flowers. It's another one that's perennial underground. So you have quite the diversity if you're lucky and spend a lot of money on raffle tickets tonight. We also have some native Havana skullcap. That's a state endangered herb that's in the mint family. Real pretty little purple flowers. Someone brought in some tillandsias. They're you got a hodgepodge of them. I'm assuming they're native. This tillandsia, I do know which one this is. This is Usneoides, which is Spanish moss. This is great if you have chickens. You can use it as nesting material. You can put it in your trees. Other birds in your yard will use it as nesting material. It's an epiphyte. It's not a parasite. You can just put this in the trees and it'll grow fine. We also have some beautiful little young blue-eyed grass, Cicerynchium angustifolium. Such a pretty name that means pig snout, Cicerynchium. And it's in the iris family with blue flowers. Seasonal plant, though. It'll usually bloom from January through June or so. Okay, we got another little pine rockland plant that only a native plant society member could love. This is Abildgardia ovata. That's about it. That's what it looks like. It has a real interesting little inflorescence if you have an imagination. And yeah, it'll get about maybe 2 or 3 times taller, but this one's really cool. This is state endangered wildflower called wild basil. It's Ocimum campechianum. State endangered, not terribly common. You only see it, I've only seen it in a handful of places. Does have very aromatic leaves. I don't think it's good culinarily speaking, but it's nice to plant along paths, I think, because as you walk by the path, you'll smell the aroma of the basil. So if you have it in front of your front door as you enter home and you smell it, you'll feel all relaxed now that you're home. Here's a plant that I discovered a couple years ago.
From your seed.
You brought this. So Karina bought some seed from me. This is Seminole pumpkin. And it's not technically native because it's a cultivated plant, but it's pretty close to being native for a cultivated plant because the Seminole Indians grew it. And they'd go around the hammocks and they'd just throw the seeds on the ground and then come back in several months and they'd collect the pumpkins. This vine will actually grow up trees. But the great thing about this vine is it's bulletproof and you'll have food in your yard. This will grow along the ground very easily. It resists some of the borers that'll destroy your acorn squash or some of your other squashes. If you don't want to put chemicals or pesticides or anything like that, this thing does really, really well. I have one vine that I planted in October of 2022, and it's still alive. It's still moving around the yard, growing around the yard. And I've harvested over 70 pumpkins on it. The pumpkin that I have is about anywhere between 1.5 and 4 pounds, depending upon how much you water it and how it's doing. But if you like butternut squash, it tastes like butternut squash. They're very tasty. Yeah. And when you harvest them, you just leave the stem on it. You can always say, contact me and I'll send you the instructions. They'll sit, if you put it in a cool room in the dark, I have some that are a year old now and they haven't spoiled. I can still eat them. I did collect 70 of them, so I can't, So they're the perfect pumpkin for South Florida because you don't have to can them, you don't have to dry them, you can just let them sit. All right, I know I'm running out of time. Oh, I got time. We're almost at the end of the table, guys. Who do you buy raffle tickets from? You can buy them from Brian. Jennifer, are you selling raffle tickets? Okay. So this is a native shrub / small tree. This is called Erythrina herbacea. It's called coral bean. It grows in North Carolina where they call it Cherokee bean. And this has real pretty red seeds, which I would not eat. They're toxic. But it's popular because it has these red tubular flowers that attract hummingbirds. So it'll often lose its leaves. That's okay. And puts out these sprays of red flowers and it'll attract hummingbirds. And the typical hummingbird you see down here is the ruby-throated. This looks like Fakahatchee grass. Is that right? Yeah. Which is Tripsicum dactyloides. Despite its name, this grows all the way up to like New Jersey. So it isn't a Fakahatchee though, but it's native down here. And this is a big bunch grass. So it'll get this tall. It doesn't have colorful inflorescences, but it's an interesting texture to your yard. And it'll have these cylindrical seeds. We have another semi-native. This is Salvia coccinea. Does not really occur in Dade, but it may occur in northern parts of Florida. It's very popular because it attracts hummingbirds, and the buntings will eat the seeds of this too. So they call this tropical sage or red sage. Coccinea means red. This is a wildflower that will spread throughout your yard. Here we have Solidago stricta, which is wand goldenrod, one of the pretty native wildflowers. It'll have a long, skinny stalk, and at the tip, it'll have a spray of yellow. And I guess someone thought it looked like a fairy wand. And it'll get about this. Some will be about that tall. Some will be about that tall, So real nice wildflower, native to pinelands and prairies in South Florida. This is another nice wildflower that you don't see as much as you used to down here. This is called blue curls, which is, so you got the scientific name on Trichostoma dichotomiflorum. Just rolls right off the tongue. These have real pretty blue flowers. It's in the mint family also, and mint family usually attracts lots of bees. We got a lot of native bees down here too. It'll attract honeybees, but a lot of our rare native bees like to use members of the mint family.
Seeds like crazy.
Good. Here we have, who brought that? Here's a federally endangered plant, Argosthamnia blodgettii. This is endemic to extreme southern tip of Florida and Dade in the Keys. Not terribly showy, but it's an unusual native plant that is found in pinelands and on the edge of the hammocks. We have two trees here. They're the same, I think. These are both blollies. And that's a nice, small, medium-sized tree. It does attract migratory birds. This can grow coastal and tolerate salt wind. And then we have a native Centrosema virginiana, which is a butterfly pea. See the three little leaflets, like many members of the pea family, but it has a real big, rather large, pink flower like that. And that'll also attract nice pollinators like bees. And then down here, we don't have cups formed yet, but it looks like we have a trio of Bahama coffee with native violet in it. You can always tell you're at a native plant study raffle because there's more than one species in a pot. That looks like it's cinnamon bark. I hope. No, marlberry. What's it say on the side? You don't know. I'd hold off on this. I wouldn't raffle that. Might be the non-native. If it's Clusia, then we definitely don't want to raffle that. This is a Forestiera segregata, the native shrub, really good for migratory birds. If you have a female, it'll have little purple berries. It's a member of the olive family. It provides significant cover. If you had a bunch of them, these make a great screen or hedge because they're fast growing and they're relatively easy to prune. A lot of hedges that we recommend as natives, the wood's pretty hard, so you have to have pretty strong hands. I'm a big advocate of people working in their own yard, and I want to make sure that you can do the work yourself. So try and choose trees that you can manage yourself. So that is everything. Back to Brian.
Use this as well.
Sure. That's. Oh, is that for the? Yeah, that's good.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much once again for this invitation. I'm here. It's really exciting. I've gone to I don't think to as many meetings as I would like to. Because you know what? Yeah. Hold on. I've got the solution to that. So it was the first meeting I came to a few years ago. I've been in Maine since 2015, and I was invited to come, and I got a wild cotton. I was telling someone earlier, and it's still going strong. It's a great plant. Okay, can everyone hear me okay? Yep. Okay, perfect. Yeah, you have in your, that's all comes in handy.
Yeah, sure.
I find my early arthritis is what's going on. Yeah, it's a lot easier. Okay. All right, thank you, everyone. My name is Cara Rockwell. I'm with Florida International University Institute of Environment. I'm also in the Department of Earth and Environment. I'm really excited about being here, so thank you once again for the invitation to come tonight. So I'm going to go into a little bit of background about who I am as a researcher and what I'm doing here in South Florida. I've been around to a lot of places and have done a lot of things. I am not a botanist. I am a forest ecologist, applied forest ecologist. I try to keep up with the botanists around me. Although I do have a lot of interest in economic botany because I do work primarily with systems that are managed by people in one way, shape, form, another. So the title of this is some of you all might know W.J. Bryan Elementary School up in North Miami. This is one of their food forests, and I got involved with food forests. And I'll go a little bit into my background about how exactly I got involved with food forests here in Miami-Dade County, but I do have some experience with agroforestry going back to my time as a Peace Corps volunteer in Paraguay, which I'll talk about a little bit. But I was really excited to see when I got here that there were a lot of these systems. And this is managed by the Education Fund, which is a nonprofit which does a lot of outreach with elementary schools, public schools, Title I schools primarily in Miami-Dade County. And this is one of their biggest and oldest food forests that is up in North Miami at W.J. Bryan. So I like to start off a lot of my discussions about food forests with this slide. Has anybody heard of Robert D.J. Hart? He is an English horticulturist. He's from the early 20th century. There's a lot of inspiration for permaculture and the idea of food forests, and it's actually a very old system going back millennia, primarily in the tropics. This idea of planting multiple layers of plants, not just an annual garden that's one layer, but trees, mid canopy, upper canopy. And he was one of the ones in the 20th century that started taking inspiration from a lot of different regions of the world, Japan, the tropics, and really had this discussion of how do you plant this perennial multi-story, this forest garden. And what you see in the background, it's from the medieval era. It's in a museum in Great Britain in the UK. And these are wild boar or boar that are being cultivated by people. And they are, I believe those are chestnuts that they're beating down from the trees. So forest gardening, even though it's slightly different than food forest, it's kind of, food forest sits under that bigger umbrella of forest gardening. But what this quote means is that we are drawn to nature. It's like that biophilia hypothesis, right? That there's something that draws us to it, and that we have this connection to the forest inherently in our evolution as the human species. And so this is going way back. I was a Peace Corps volunteer, late 90s, early 2000s. I was an agroforestry volunteer. So that's where the agroforestry came in. I actually did my undergraduate in biology. So I got a very well-rounded education of biological sciences. As many of you who did it as well, you know, you just don't do biology, you do organic chemistry 1, organic chemistry 2. But I found something was missing. You know, I had a great education, but I realized actually before this, I worked in Michigan was in a natural area preservation program with the city of Ann Arbor, working with restoration of tall grass prairie and oak hickory forests, doing a lot of burns. I became a bit of a firebug. Then I went to this part of South America, and they're like, fire's bad, don't do it. It was kind of a bummer. But what I really enjoyed was working with people who are managing their forests, trying to restore their forests, working with their multi-storied home gardens. And that's another name for food forests. That was a name I learned, multi-storied home garden. It wasn't until I got to Florida and I started hearing to South Florida, because I'm actually from Tallahassee, North Florida, but I heard that term food forest for the first time when I came here. And so what you see here, these are native trees that are planted with cotton below it. So it's kind of like an alley cropping system. It's an agroforestry system. I also got really involved with working with the kids. We planted a lot of citrus, mango. I taught them how to graft, right? It was great. And then below in the lower hand, right hand side, that is my counterpart who was helping me integrate into the community. And what I found there was this is in Eastern Paraguay, where they had deforested most of this this is the Mata Atlantica. So this is not the Amazon rainforest, but it's like the Atlantic forest and kind of the subtropical, tropical area of South America. And this was in the interior part of it. And the vast majority of the forest in my community where I was had been deforested as of the 80s. So we were replanting a lot of stuff, and the soil was really tired. It had been depleted of a lot of nutrients, because what people did was they used traditional forms of slash and burning, the Swidden agriculture, which works when you have a lot of forests and you can keep moving and the population density is low. But when you have a higher population and you have less land to work with and you keep burning year after year, you can imagine what happens to your soil. So what he has here is Cannavalio, which I have seen here in South Florida. It's jack bean. So it recuperates the soil quite nicely. It's a nitrogen fixer. So this was my entry into the agroforestry world. So I just wanted to go really briefly, give you an overview of what I do as a researcher. And actually, the big chunk of my life has been looking at disturbed natural forest systems. And this is from southeastern Peru, Brazil, but here on the right-hand side, I have had the pleasure of doing a lot of work in Big Cypress and in the Everglades. And this is actually from some of you might be familiar with Gator Hook, Roberts Lake. Yeah, it's in that area. So where they harvested back in the 1940s and 50s. And so, but at the same time, I still keep my toes dipped into agroforestry. And as I was mentioning, when I got to Miami, I realized actually what happened was a colleague asked me what it is that I did when I lived in South America. And I mentioned the agroforestry, and she's like, would you be interested in teaching a food forest class? And lo and behold, when I started teaching the food forest class, at first I was like, food forest. And I ran back to my book, that had all the agroforestry terms in it. And I was like, oh, it's multi-storied home garden. I know what that is. And so the idea is that you plant multiple layers, as I was mentioning, of plants close to your home, very common in the tropics, and it's primarily historically, traditionally managed by women, because that way you wouldn't have to go out into the fields really far from home. You could keep your kids close by and you could harvest the fruits and medicinal plants and whatever. And so we started working initially with the Education Fund. We had a couple of grants with them, surveying the school gardens, the food forest gardens. Now I think they have like 30. When I started, there was like 22, 23. This one is Kelsey Fire, which is up in Brownsville. I've also done some work, and part of that project was collecting data. For a couple of years, we collected data. We're still sifting through it. I mean, if you think plant diversity is incredible, try insect diversity. I was an amateur insect aficionado in the beginning, and so it is surprising how much time it takes to identify all those guys, but that is a long-legged fly, so it's a really good sign of a healthy environment. They offer a lot of predation services. And this is Possum Trot Farm. We have not finished. It's thousands upon thousands of trees. It's right next to Cox Hammock, which sits north of Castello Hammock. This is Cox Hammock right here. It's about 5 or 6 acres, a remnant hardwood hammock, and this is now FIU property. So it's a lot of, it's a very nice fruit orchard. Okay, so what I wanted to do was start off this discussion. And if I start running over anything, you let me know. I can talk forever on this stuff. So I'm going to start with this photo. This is taken up somewhere in north central Florida. This is like a oak pine mix. You might recognize a lot of the tillandsia growing, the Spanish moss growing everywhere. And this is a natural native forest. Probably, many forest scenes like this, varying degrees of management. Some areas do get the fire, some don't. You contrast it with this. So you go back to this, see how many multiple species are there. You go to something like this, although we probably all love corn, right? Typically, a lot of conventional agriculture is like this with one crop that's growing over hundreds of acres. And so you combine those two ideas, and that's what agroforestry is. So it's the intentional combining of agriculture and working trees to create sustainable farming systems. We do have a few examples in Florida and South Florida. There are people who experiment beyond the food forest. People who use windbreaks. That's a windbreak. So really the idea behind that is, and it's actually really quite good in Florida, which is hurricane prone, is that you have these trees that act as a line of defense against strong winds. You have silvopastoral system where you actually plant shade tolerant grass and have your cows. And cows, when you look at cows when you're in Florida, say, for example, some of those cattle farms in Orlando and that area, when it's really hot, where are they sitting? They're sitting under the trees, right? The shade of the trees. This is an alley cropping system where you have typically an annual crop going between those rows of trees. And that's I don't know what species is underneath there, but forest gardening. So multiple examples of agroforestry systems. So the idea behind agroforestry as well and how it's managed is that it's managed as if it's a natural forest, right? And it's mimicking those stages of succession. And this is the idea that it becomes more of this quote unquote closed system as opposed to the typical conventional agricultural system. And so the idea behind that closed system, going back to Robert J. DeHart, flash forward a few decades later, back in the 70s, these two guys from, I believe they're both from Queensland, Australia, but definitely both from Australia, Bill Mollison and David Holmgren, started talking about this concept of permaculture, perennial culture. And it's just not referring just to the cultivation of plants, but also in terms of community. And I had heard of permaculture when I had friends who were involved in it. And like a lot of people, I don't know if this is always typical of academia, but we kind of, it was a little bit it was very much of that era in the 1970s, but about communal interactions. But the ideas behind the perennial culture, like permaculture in terms of food forests and how we grow food are very sound, right? And I'll describe a little bit about what that is. I mean, this is just a general idea behind permaculture. And not all of it has to do with how we grow food, but it's a code of conduct, I guess is the best way to put it. But the idea with growing food is that you have few external inputs, right? So reducing the fertilizer, getting rid of it completely. getting rid of the pesticide as well. So this brings us to this idea again of food forestry. And I have all of the terms that can be used, but right now the real trendy word is food forest. And I actually, when I started teaching that class in fall 2016 at FIU, I had a very hard time finding very many, articles on it, like scientific peer-reviewed articles. A lot on, I knew about all the agroforestry articles that are from the literature base in the tropics, ton. But in terms of temperate food forest examples, not so much. Now, when you look up in Google Scholar, you can go look it up. Tons of people are getting interested in this concept of food forest in the urban landscape in particular. I also had a hard time finding tropical examples, right? A lot of the books that you find out there, they really do focus more on the temperate zone as opposed to down here in the subtropical, tropical region. But you kind of get the idea where you have, and it's typically, right here it has 7 layers. I mean, it can be 9 layers. It's really more, there's no rhyme or reason, and it definitely depends on the person who is designing the garden. But where you have a canopy layer, the top layer, then a lower tree layer, or like a mid-canopy, shrub layer, herbaceous layer, so that, a lot of your medicinal herbs, like basil, like whatever you might be growing that's not about, doesn't get taller than knee high. Root vegetables, like your tubers, soil surface, and vertical layer. That's your vines. And so again, that's really something, the different layers. If you're thinking about designing a food forest, it's really better not to get so fixated on the exact number of layers. I think it really depends on what you are hoping to produce out of the food forest. And these are some photos from a time when I was really getting excited about taking pictures of flowers in the garden. Yeah, you guys are plant lovers, so does anybody recognize that one? Yes, it is an edible hibiscus. That one in particular is the cranberry hibiscus, and actually it's very red. It's a nice, because so much of the garden is green, but it's a nice flash of pinkish red whenever you have that. That one, does anybody recognize it? Let me say it. Yeah, it's a sweet potato. Yeah, yeah. This one, that one's a little bit less common. Yeah, good job. Yeah, it's a bazella, so it actually is in its own family. That one, that is a wild type of carica papaya, believe it or not, which I always thought it was not a native of Florida, but here's where all the economic botany gets a little crazy, and it just botany in general of where trying to find the origin. According to Alan Frank, when he was at FIU, he sees this as a native, right? And I actually have been in Cape Sable, pretty far remote as you can get. What did I see? I got there, a big grove of wild papaya. So it's apparently, he said that it's in the paleoarchaeological record going way back, but potentially could have been something that was traded with indigenous from the Caribbean, been here a long time, but it's all the way down in South America too. So who knows? When you start going down that rabbit hole, trying to figure out where all these plants come from, the plants have moved around so much, it gets very complicated. And this one is, yeah, you have a garden, you have a food forest garden, yeah. And it's in the Phyllocamphaceae family, yeah, but Kutukit. And a lot of these, so I will tell you, so we are gonna get to the native plants. So when Jean asked me to do this, I was like, are you sure you want me to talk? Because I was throwing out some other options. I was like, the Native Plant Society, you want me to talk about the food forest? Because the vast majority of species are not from here, although I'll show you some data. It's not a data heavy presentation, but we are gathering data Florida-wide, and you'd be surprised how many native plants people do plant. But the vast majority that we have found, without going too deep of a dive into it, because there are some ones that are still questionable, vast majority of the plants that we find in the food forest gardens, especially here in South Florida, are neotropical, and followed by a lot of Southeast Asian species, and then quite a few African species, but by far and large, Caribbean, Latin American, neotropical. Okay, so just going really quickly, some of the benefits, why would you want to plant a food forest? And by the way, this is a really great, there's a nice toolkit, USDA National Agroforestry Center. I always like to talk up our partners. There's a lot of great outreach materials for people who are interested in planting these type of systems. But they can diversify income. We have come across a few food forests here in Florida that do derive income from them. So increasing cash flow, increasing health benefits, because it's a great source of fresh produce, and increasing cultural and social connections. So there's really a lot I have seen in Miami in the food forests that I've visited, because, for example, the education fund, with their work, what they try to do when they go into schools, they look at the ethnic makeup in these communities. What is their history? What's their cultural background? And they do plant some new food forest species for the school, but they try to really reflect what's going on around them. And then, you know, families come and visit, they harvest the food. Grandparents can come and say, oh, you know what? I had that, like, you know, in Hispaniola, like Dominican Republic or Haiti. And so the Haitian basket vine is one that's really planted a lot, you know, in the communities in North Miami and Little Haiti. And that one, I think, is also native. That's a trichostigma. But if anybody knows where I can get some, please let me know, because that one is a really cool plant. And I'm hoping to maybe put a student on that to study it a little bit more, because it's definitely got a unique and interesting history. So food forests, they meet both urban agriculture and urban forestry objectives. So why is that important? Well, so USDA calls, if you live within a mile radius that does not have access to fresh produce, that is a food desert. And surprisingly, Florida, for as much as we can grow here, there are a lot of food deserts, voila, all over the state of Florida. And so one of the ideas behind food forests is that it provides a really, I wouldn't say easy, you know how it is planting gardens and maintaining gardens, not always easy, but it's definitely a great way to take advantage of a small area of space, because literally you could have a 4x6 area planted with a lot of different plants, edible plants, medicinal plants, and call that a food forest. But it definitely, it provides a resource for local communities. And we also, at the same time, I'm sure you all are probably familiar with the fact that Miami-Dade County, very surprisingly, has a very low canopy percentage, 20%. And there are some areas like Pinecrest is one of the heaviest canopy covers in the county, Coral Gables, Coconut Grove, you see where I'm going, like it definitely is concentrated in areas that are wealthier. So with food forests, even though it's generally a smaller area, typically the fruit trees, with some exceptions, like a mango, they're not super tall canopy, but it is providing a cool, go underneath a food forest in like August, you will feel a difference between stepping out in a green open area and going underneath the food forest. So it's kind of, it's interesting, just as somebody who's looking for funding all the time for like doing these urban agroforestry projects, and I've gotten on literally on some reviews that go to agricultural reviewers. This seems more like forestry. You should be like applying with US Forest Service. US Forest Service are like, at least when I first started, that's changing. It seems like agriculture, right? So, but it is a mix of those two. And so just kind of writing here, I'm sure a lot of you have heard that term ecosystem services and what that means. And it's broken down here into 4 basic types. And there's, you know, any garden really in a lot of ways can provide this. But I think the food forest is even more so because of its complex architecture, because it has that upper canopy level. Supporting services, which include pollination, habitat provision, provisioning services like food, regulating services, carbon sequestration, pest and disease control, and cultural services, ecotourism, spiritual uses, etc. And these are all pictures from the work that we've done. That was, I think, all related to the work in the schools. Parasitoid wasp, really cool, beneficial group of insects. That is with moringa, with a honeybee. And I know, I'm sure a lot of you, because of your interest in native plants, I mean, honeybees, I kept honeybees for a long time, but I do realize that we do want to encourage native pollinators as well, but I always get excited. I always try to take pictures of them when I see them in the flowers like that. That's a teacher workshop, which I've done a lot of, conducting canopy estimations, and of course, below ground services are really important and very rich in these food forests. That was my daughter sticking her hands in compost. That was when she was like 7. She's now like 15. She doesn't do that anymore. So these are all pictures, urban food forests managed for food security and nutrition. And that's primarily what a lot of these food forest gardens have historically served for. And I mean, a lot of these are taken in local schools. These are from my food forest class. I'm not sure, I don't know. This is definitely Miami-Dade County Public School food forest. You can see they have all different types of designs, right? And banana circles actually, a lot of people start their food forest with a banana circle. And what exactly is a banana circle? Not a native, but one of our oldest in terms of being cultivated by humans, literally thousands of years. They think it's somewhere like Papua New Guinea, the Philippines, in that area where it started. But there's such heavy feeders that you can put the plant bananas in a circle and throw your compost in there, and they just turn it over very quickly. When you dig into a banana circle, the soil is so rich. We did that a few times with students for student projects. I mean, just a wealth of like invertebrates in these, and a lot of them native, some non-native, but definitely a lot of native invertebrates below ground. And this has generated a lot of interest with the public. This is from Edible South Florida, just talking about food forest. New York Times a reporter from their climate section called me up. I don't know how she found my name, and I forwarded her to the Broward County schools building food forests in their schoolyards. So they got written up. They were very excited about that. That's from one of the schools in Hollywood. And this is actually from Cara. He's the first teachers I worked with. Does anybody know the tree? Not native, this one that he's standing next to. It's not so common yet in Miami-Dade. It doesn't like the cold too much. Yeah, excellent. Yeah, fabulous. So it is, it's one that tends to not do well when it drops below 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Like some tropical trees, they're very sensitive. That might be easier to overcome in the future, unfortunately, but that's one that actually he got to fruit quite often. Delicious fruit. And these are just some of the very common trees that we have found. Actually, this one is here so much, but persimmon up north in North Florida, where I'm from, it's really common fruit. But these are definitely some of the canopy trees that we find in these food forests. And so really quickly, I just, before I go into discussion about the native plants in these food forest gardens, I don't know if there are any questions yet about the system. I just wanted to give you an introduction, just to give you a little bit of an idea of what it is. And this is kind of culminated into my work, or highlighting a few of the products that have come out of it. This is actually my student about to graduate. She's done a statewide food forest survey. We got money a few years ago from Florida Forest Service. What they wanted to do was really promote this. They said that they were getting more and more questions about it. And historically, Florida Forest Service is really focused on, in the urban areas, street trees, timber management with smallholders, but the food forest thing was quite new to them. So we just came in at an opportune moment. This is a really nice couple, Bob Glazier, he and his wife Merlou, he worked for the Florida Fish and Wildlife in the Keys, and that's in Marathon. And this one is closer. This is Snipe Park in Fort Lauderdale. And that's a really nice food forest. And it's been around for quite some time. And we have, in case you want to check out more about this project, let's see, and we'll have this one. Okay, yeah. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So this is, I don't know if anybody's heard of StoryMap, the ArcGIS platform. They're great. It's really a great way to do outreach work with the public because it gets them involved in an interactive feature, and it's, it has the map component, which I think is really important, especially for kids. And we did one, the Pine Rockland Environmental History a few years back, which was really very exciting. So let that load up. So these are all our study sites in Florida. And so I won't spend too much time on this, but we had most of our food forests are in South Florida. And there were a few reasons for that. I mean, so A, we're biased because we know this area better, right? We had a lot of by the time this rolled around, a really big network of people that we knew that did food forestry. We also, from this study and interviewing people that are that were involved in this project, we believe, I mean, population density is higher here, but there's a really culturally diverse group of people in South Florida. And this is a very, this food forest type of gardening is very commonly used as well in Caribbean and Latin America. And so I think the popularity, we think, based on the information that we've been gathering, that it really, even though it was going on in other parts of the country, that the springboard in Florida was here. And actually, Florida Gulf Coast University has one of the oldest food forests. And that's a great one to visit. Actually, most of our food forests are available to visit for the public, with the exception of the Miami-Dade County Public Schools. Obviously, they're public, but getting access to the schools, as you can imagine, is pretty complex. So anyway, I'll go back to this. Oh, there we go. Okay. All right. I don't know, are you okay with seeing the presenters? Yeah. Okay. Uh-oh. It says you're screen sharing. Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah. Okay. I just hopefully, I mean, if they see the presenter like slides, it's fine because I don't have any notes on it. All right, so here we go. So we're talking about native plants. And I love native plants. I've got a lot in my yard, but if there's anything I say that you might disagree with, just raise your hand, okay? So if I identify something incorrectly. So this is something we've noticed, a trend. It's not huge yet at this point, and I don't think it's been really promoted a lot by food forest practitioners and aficionados. We hope that will change. And every time I work with like the Education Fund or other partners, we always discuss the possibility of planting native plants in their food forest gardens. I think that's really important. And this is the one I mentioned from Marathon. Actually have it certified as a wildlife habitat and a monarch butterfly sanctuary garden. And so, but they also have they have a beautiful, I would say it's not huge, 1/4 of an acre maybe. And they've planted a lot of edibles, for the Keys, right? The Keys are very different climate, well, slightly different than here. I'll go into that in a little bit too. But by planting natives, you're supporting local native biodiversity, enhancing ecosystem services provided by food forests because they bring even more ecosystem services in, providing new sources of food to the food forest garden because we have a lot of edible natives, right? And contributing to restoration efforts in our backyard gardens. Now that's a little controversial. I mean, people wouldn't normally think of like food forestry, agroforestry, anything agricultural as being part of the restoration scheme, but there's been some discussion about that in literature. I'm just going to point out 2 articles that I really have enjoyed. This one's a little bit older, 2010, Urban Realities, Contribution of Residential Gardens to Conservation Urban Forest Remnants, and Exploring the Potential of Food Forestry to Assist in Ecological Restoration. The idea being is that if you are cultivating food gardens, that if you incorporate natives, especially in those areas that are adjacent to native plant communities or remnants of those native plant communities, that can be extremely beneficial to those areas, right? That you're not planting invasives, that you're planting additional natives in your yard, even though you're focused maybe on the edible, tropical edibles, whatever kind of edible species, that you have an opportunity to also enhance your yard with some of those natives. And you're not using heavy doses of pesticide that kill native pollinators, for example, that will also cross over into those native areas. Birds as well. I'm always shocked in my neighborhood, Coconut Grove, how many people use pesticides. I mean, we love trees, although I thought that we've lost a lot of tree canopy in Coconut Grove the last few years. But people do use a lot of pesticide, but people love birds, right? I'm like, well, you do know a lot of those birds are insectivorous, right? I mean, it's kind of, you have to look at it from a very holistic perspective. in terms of how you're, I mean, I know I'm preaching to the choir here. You all wouldn't be here as part of the Florida Native Plant Society if you all didn't believe this as well. But I do definitely see food forests as potentially benefiting those remnant hammocks and pine rocklands if we incorporate some of those native plants and if we avoid some of those non-native invasives. And those are planted as well in some of these food forests, and I'll get to that in a second. So really quickly, just wanted to highlight, it's one of my favorites. I know it is a weed, Biden's alba, and I'm not going to demonstrate the data. We did find it in the gardens that had Biden's alba, and I kept talking to the lead teachers and the folks, the food forest managers, who would cut it back because it's typically seen as competing with other plants. And I'm like, well, if you're planting a little seedling and kind of planted it too early, I can see where, I mean, Biden's alba gets very, it grows very quickly, right? But it's hands down one of those plants that just attracts pollinators, especially honeybees, like no one's business. So if you're trying to grow fruit, that is a good plant to have. And actually, this is my current student, Blair Kleiman, Dr. Copter's former student, and this was her master's project. She was working with Suzanne. She looked in all native weeds, I mean, which is a relative term, right? And I love how it's the world's most unwanted plant to help trees make more fruit. I was like, wow. But it's great that they highlighted her work. But what she was finding is that those mangoes trees, the fruiting was much more productive in the areas where the farmer had not cut the weeds around the tree. So interesting, right? And Biden's alba actually was one of her common quote unquote weeds. This is the Hamelia patens. That's one actually that I do see quite a bit being planted in food forests. If there is one, and I'll show you the data from that. It seems to be, and it's a beautiful plant, right? And I think that's one of the reasons people do plant it, but it also attracts a lot of pollinators. So I just wanted to give a little shout out to Blair there. And actually she connected to this idea of incorporating native plants into your food forest garden. I don't want to forget to sing the song about how important the native insects are. And we have really tried to make that connection with the school kids, just in terms of, not just in terms of how they interact with native plants, but also non-native tropical edibles and how important they are, because there is a little bit of that ick factor still about insects, across the population, unfortunately, even though without them, if we wouldn't have all this food. And we've done a lot of outreach materials studying the insects, and not all of these are native, but some of them are. We just want people to appreciate them a little bit more. And kids, I think, really, they react well to that, at least at the elementary school age. And so I wanted to give a few case studies that we've come across where we do actually see them incorporating native plants. And then actually in these two cases are really interesting because they're food forest gardens planted underneath the canopy of native tree species. And so this is from one of our case studies up in North Florida, my neck of the woods. Treehouse permaculture. It's a young couple, Henry and Bergen, and they are actually selling their produce from their food forest. They have two food forests, one in downtown Tallahassee, the other one in Woodville. And in Woodville, this is where they have fruit trees and annuals planted underneath, longleaf pine, and it's actually longleaf with some loblolly that has not been managed with fire for a very long time. So it's very, you can kind of see it, very brushy, a lot of fuel back there. But I found it a very intriguing way to plant a food forest garden. Not everybody's cup of tea, but I mean, sure, I'd rather see them do that than, develop it, right? But they are not using any pesticide, no fertilizer, and they're doing a great job. This one's closer to home. It's not what I would say a typical food forest garden, but I'd say it's more the forest gardening. This is from Patch of Heaven. I don't know if anybody has been there, sitting in the room. So they have planted, and this is a fairly old system. Oh, it's got to be at least a decade. It's gorgeous. It's not within everybody's, I mean, they obviously had a lot of funding to do this, but they have planted cacao and coffee. This is Cafe Arabica. I think it's not the Robusta, planted underneath hardwood hammock canopy. So it's interesting. And I think that cacao is doing really well and actually produces. I've had 2, 3 cacaos in my yard, never produced, flowered, but not produced, unfortunately. And I think there's a variety of reasons for that, but this is also an example of maybe, again, not everybody's cup of tea of planting exotics in the native hammock, and this is a hammock remnant, and it's, I think this might be an extension of Castello. But anyway, it's not, neither one of these species are invasive. And this is from my own yard. And so I do have a mix. I live in Coconut Grove and Southeast Grove. I'm not a good plant mom. I will just tell you that right now. We talked about resilience. The plants I plant in my yard have to be resilient. I don't take really, I mean, I do take care of them, but if one doesn't make it, I don't go out of my way to make sure it makes it. So I just wanted to show a couple of instances where we have, so this is caimito, which is a really fantastic fruit. And I've got some psychotria, like, I know everybody has psychotria, right? Planted underneath it. The sea grape I find is a really, I know it's, we were just discussing earlier how it's becoming more prevalent in some of the areas that it's, in the Buttonwood hammock kind of taking over in some areas in Everglades National Park, but I think it's a great species to plant and it's obviously delicious fruit. Here's a zamia next to, this is the cacao, it never produces. Beautyberry, which I grew up with beautyberry being from Florida, and I've never eaten it. Has anybody ever eaten beautyberry or had the jam from it? Apparently it's delicious. I think, so I know you're a good jam maker, but I don't think I had some of, I know Viola nodiflora, and that's one I'm experimenting with. I tend to use sweet potato a lot and longevity spinach as ground covers. But I mean, that one I'm hoping that will be a nice native ground cover in some areas of the garden. So just kind of my experiments with native plants with tropical edibles. And again, I think this is really, important to have this diversity of plants, whether they be exotic, native. And I know that I'm not going to create a mini pine rockland. Well, I know some people here probably have created mini pine rocklands and hardwood hammocks in their backyards, but I really do like having the tropical fruits too. That's been really exciting, for my kids, they were both born in South America, to come to Florida and to be able to have some of the same species we had when they were young. And so this is, how am I doing on time? 8:30? Okay. So this is from the study I mentioned that we were doing across the state of Florida, and this is a lot of text. I don't think we can read this super well, but so here we are now 11A, and the USDA change every 10 years. They come out with new hardiness zones or 11A. They say because we're not because we're getting hotter, but because they didn't have as many monitoring stations around. But but I think some people, you talk to farmers, they're like, well, I've not been able to grow squash the same way I have like 10 years ago. It's a winter crop. And actually, Blair is working with squash farmers right now, and they're like, you can't grow squash the way you could like a few decades ago. It just is too hot in the winter. So 11A, we have, so this is like the most common species in the food forest across all of these USDA hardiness zones. And you'll see that firebush is actually 10B is the most common one. And so we do have natives that are actually quite common. We also have, these are all the non-native invasives from the FISC list that were found in this study. So we had in all the different families, super diverse, but over 2,700 individual plants, and out of 23, this was 23 food forests, 463 plant species. I was shocked. I didn't think she was going to get that high. She included everything: weeds, natives, non-natives, like volunteers, everything. 4%. 17 species are FISC listed, right? So a very low amount. So there are people who love their guava. I think I love guava too. I don't plant it in my yard because that is on that list. Sapodilla is on that list, unfortunately. Taro is on that list. So we do have a lot of edibles that are on the FISC list, and I'm always careful to say to people when they ask, I'm like, it's great, just make sure you keep an eye on it, because if it starts getting into like native habitat, we're in trouble. So this has been a really interesting, comprehensive study in terms of what we're seeing from North to South Florida, but we do know wild coffee was actually the 5th most common in 11A, the Psychotria. So a lot of people are planting Psychotria in South Florida in their food forests. And this is just another, she's mapped everything using Survey 123, which is a great, if anybody has tried it before, fortunately we have the license through FIU. I think it can get quite expensive, but there are other, I think there's a kind of more of a freeware similar to ArcGIS that you can use to do the same thing. Different designs. This one, does anybody recognize that? That's in Cocoa Walk. It's like a little mini food forest. It's very, very narrow, ready to grow. Planted it for Cocoa Walk. And I'm not going to go into this. It's online. It's the USDA Plant Hardiness Zone. You can look if you want to know what your zip code, and we already told you we're 11A, but you can look it up through the USDA's website. But really helpful because that USDA hardiness zone for 11A puts us between 40 and 35 for winter temperatures. But I mean, we haven't seen 35, I don't think, in a long time, right? It's, I think the last long, hard cold snap, and I wasn't here then, somebody told me it was 2010, it was like 2 weeks, very cold weather, killed a lot of iguanas for sure, dropped off the trees. But that's becoming rare and rare occurrence. Okay, so take-home messages. High plant diversity is supporting high diversity of other native organisms and providing habitat. I think this is always key. And I'm sure all of you have had experience with this, that we know there's these important cascading effects from having lots of plants, different species in your yard. High, because it's not just the plants we're thinking about, right? High diversity of beneficial organisms, in turn providing multiple ecosystem services. I wanted to highlight that one again in terms of insects, how important they are, but you could also say the same for birds and other organisms. High diversity of edible resilient plants contribute to availability of local fresh produce. And I mean, they're resilient. I think that one thing I did not mention food forests in terms of the plants that have been highlighted here. They are resilient to higher temperatures, drought. These are tough plants, and they can really, they're persistent, which is important. And I think this type of food forest system, when it's getting hotter and hotter and can grow perennial edible species in the summertime, where very few annual plants can be grown, like okra is one of the few that's grown here annual during the summertime. So it provides a great source of food during those summer months. And the presence of biodiverse food forests can potentially support adjacent or nearby natural areas if gardeners avoid invasive plant species and cultivate native plants alongside tropical edibles. And this is something I'm just thinking about more and more. So there's some great resources. These are a few. USDA National Agroforestry Center. This guy's really interesting. He's actually pretty local, Broward County. He's now somewhere, I think, in Collier County. But actually, he's been doing food forestry for a long time. Our guide to edible species, food forest species of South Florida, I've got like 25. So I will leave them here if anybody wants one. I think we've done a pretty good job of not including invasive species. If we have one in there, I apologize in advance. We have tried to refrain from putting, although some of our members were really aiming to put like something like sapodilla because it does have a long cultural history in the Caribbean, but we're like, we don't want to encourage people to plant something that's going to take over anywhere. And also I brought another book I happen to have at home from my office. This has just come out recently, Transforming Florida Yards. This woman is from beach, so it is more, she veers more towards the tropical and subtropical, so ideal for, and she does have some invasives in there. I think she has, she might have Mamordica, but she does mention that they are eat them. I'm not sure I agree. Some things you just cannot, and actually that really surprises me that you see planted in Miami, not just volunteers, but the Brazilian pepper. I'm really shocked at how often I see people planting it. I wonder if it's just, it is edible, right? It gives food a very flavorful, like peppery taste, but there's no way that you can eat that much Brazilian pepper and like keep the population down. It's just so prolific. And I'd like to thank all of my lab members that participated on the EPA, USDA, Florida Forest Service projects with food forests, all the students and all of these amazing partners with without these guys, we never would have been able to do this work. And I guess I'll take questions and my email address. If we run out of these and you want one, let me know. That's my email address. So thank you very much. Thank you. I have any questions? Yes.
On that one study that you did of the diversity of Florida and the
Right.
you had amelia.
Yes.
I didn't realize that was edible.
So no, but it's not, even though she has it listed as the #1 plant, I don't think people are planting it because it's edible. I don't think it is edible. Does anybody know? I think, is it?
It's very bitter. Yeah.
So you can potentially, that's how I feel about beautyberry. I think I had it once when I was a kid, I'm like, but then somebody told me it's great.
So basically, it's not just for food. It's for
Pretty, I think it's like aesthetics. I mean, it's a beautiful plant, right? But it's also a great pollinator. So I think that's my understanding. And like psychotria, which I guess potentially you can also eat, but has anybody tried that? I really veer from things that have kind of names like that, psychotria vomitoria, which I am drinking now. I think it's great, but it is very bitter. But I think that there are some plants that she found in the just very plentiful because either A, they were volunteers, or B, because people planted them for reasons other than like aesthetic reasons. Thanks. Anybody else? Yeah.
So I have one from YouTube. Someone was asking early on where you served in the Peace Corps.
In Paraguay. Yeah. Landlocked. Just a quick story, like when I was living in Michigan, and my boyfriend at the time, who's Chris Barilotto, you might know, some of you might know him, he's director of ICTB and the FIU bio department, colleague of Suzanne Copter's. He was going to French Guiana for his PhD fieldwork. I wasn't ready to go back to school, and I was like, and I had a lot of friends who were in Peace Corps, and so I applied to Peace Corps, and back then you would get 2 options. And the first one they gave me was like former Soviet bloc, Eastern Europe, very cold. I've been in Michigan for 3 years. I want someplace warm. And then they gave me Paraguay. And I was like, I think that's landlocked. I mean, like Florida girl, like I like the ocean. So I had to go to the map. I'm like, yes, it's landlocked, but it's close to Brazil. So yes, I ended up in Paraguay. I loved it. It was a great experience. Yeah.
And then I had one too. You often, hear about natural forests becoming old growth forests over time.
Like the secondary forest moving to, yeah.
Mature forest. Are there any examples that you know of old growth food forests that have been maintained for many?
So, I mean, I guess it depends on what you call a food forest. Like the Ethiopian forest gardens. I don't know if you've heard there's sacred gardens. And actually, one of our colleagues in Earth and Environment, Mahadev Bhatt, has done some work with them. And there's actually some sacred groves like that in India as well. I mean, agroforestry is so old, right? And that you have these forests in certain parts of the world, in Ethiopia and India come to mind as a couple of examples where you have these old groves that have been maintained for millennia, right? Literally. And so that to me, they're old growth agroforestry systems, not necessarily natural, but they have persisted through time because people have tended to them. So yeah, that does exist. And that there also has been some work done with colleagues in South America who have looked at distribution of certain economic species like Brazil nut and have suggested that Brazil nut groves, because I worked with Brazil nut too. We don't think that's the case in Western Amazon. Just the spatial distribution is a little more scattered. They actually have these concentrated groves in Eastern Amazon where they think that shows up in places like Guyana Shield. They don't think it originated. A lot of things are being traded in by in Brazil. It's delicious. Brazil, like a milk, it's very much like coconut milk, very nutritious, a lot of fat. That's what they think, that those concentrations of certain economic species of there's a lot of examples like that. People have, I mean, as you know, like just traveled all over with plants. Think about the neotropical plants like sweet potato, chocolate, hot pepper. I mean, anyone wasn't spicy, right? But it originated in the neotropics. Well, and I think the epicenter of diversity for hot pepper is in Andes, highlands, right? Then traveled, exploded all around the world. Amazing how far they. Any other? Yes, you had a question. Yeah.
And what that slide behind was, there's a video, probably on YouTube, of the astronauts, and they're eating all this ready to, whatever meals are ready, and then they have lettuce.
Yeah.
And they harvest the lettuce.
Right.
And they each get a week, and they look so happy.
To eat something like, yeah, no.
So
There's something about eating fresh produce, right? I mean, I've done it like going out camping where a few weeks and you have had nothing but canned food, and fresh produce tastes so good when you like get back home. And so you can imagine for a lot of families, a lot of kids, that they don't have that experience. It's yeah. Yeah, and there's something that connects, exactly, I totally agree. And there's a connection that you have when you're a young kid growing, and I notice this with my kids as well. It's getting harder and harder, 12 and 15, they're kind of off in their own world, but making that connection with planting a seed, watching it grow and harvesting the food from that, there's a real satisfaction. That's how I grew up as well. And it kind of ties us, it's important, I think, to tie back to our old history. I mean, a lot of us, no matter where you came from, I'm sure that we all hit a farmer or two in our, going back a few generations, and maintaining that connection, that history, and that knowledge about the agroecology is important in terms of like learning from somebody else in your family who's been growing, who learned it from their, grandparent, who learned it from their grandparent. And I think that is really, that connection to plants and eating stuff that you've grown yourself is really very satisfying. Yeah. Yes. Which is yes. Yes, and I agree. And then this is something where, okay, with permaculturists, they will tell you, they're true permaculturists, they don't believe in pruning, which I find it depends on what you're interested in, because if you're interested in fruiting like mango, kaimito, star fruit. I mean, actually, I think we're really bad about pruning. Our star fruit just goes like gangbusters all the time. So that might be an anomaly. But I think that if you are thinking about how to initiate, well, first of all, if it's so tall, you can't harvest the fruit unless you get on the ladder, right? Which is kind of precarious. So it's good to prune them back so you don't have to reach as far. I think it's healthier for the tree. It stresses the tree when you have a big heavy canopy and like some branches we have a lot of storms, right? It's dangerous for the house, dangerous for you, and it's also not great for to get some of the branches knocked back and it never gets trimmed, and so then you get some fungus or bacterial infection inside of the wood. So I think in general, I think it's a good idea to prune, but yes, it is expensive. And there is a whole industry now. We see a lot of young people coming out of our department who are interested in this because they know that it's a booming business, right? Because most people don't do it themselves. But there are ways that you can get that training through Miami-Dade College. Their horticulture program is run by Teresa Tremansky. I think they do an amazing job. They have a whole class on pruning, and you can potentially take that class and at least learn about what the factors are that go into like deciding when a tree gets pruned and how it gets pruned. Yeah. Yes.
So there's a couple of questions from YouTube. One I'm asking to rephrase because not quite sure what they mean, but one person was asking where you grew up and if you by chance grew up on a farm.
So I did not grow up on a farm. I grew up in Tallahassee, which I think, for my daughter who's grown up in Miami, she thinks that's growing up on a farm. She thinks it's very country, like deep south. I mean, Tallahassee's not a big town, but I spent a lot of time, family in Tennessee and East Texas who had farms. So when I had an opportunity, I was on farms a lot, but I didn't really spend a lot of time consistently until I was a Peace Corps volunteer. I actually worked when I was working with the city of Ann Arbor with the Natural Area Preservation Program, and I had always grown up with a garden, backyard garden. My parents, they were part of the whole 70s hippie era, and we always had a vegetable garden. And when I went to Ann Arbor, I missed that, and I started working on a farm on the weekends. I just couldn't get enough, and so I got tapped into the organic gardening farming group there in Ann Arbor. Became part of a CSA. So I've always wanted to support. I mean, I think what farmers do and what they're going through in terms of all the trials and tribulations of the 21st century and trying to make a go of it, I want to support them as much as possible.
And the other question hasn't been rephrased, but I'll just read it as it's written.
Okay.
They asked, is there any reason to be concerned about food forests with planted native plants could introduce genetics that are not well adapted to our local ecosystem?
In terms of the native plants, if you, depending on where you get them, I mean, I think that's always a consideration, right? I don't know if it's going to be necessarily dangerous, but your plant might not make it if it's not local, right? And I think that, and that's something that we, you know, if you go and buy, you know, actually the Eco Global Farm, some of you all might recognize the name. It's been around a long time. It's was started by missionaries who were working overseas, and they realized that one of the biggest needs was for people to grow food, and they started growing. It had a seed hub and started growing a lot of this on their farm so they could produce more seed to take back to the places they were working overseas. You know, they have a lot of different varieties. I think it's important to test those varieties. I don't think we, and actually, and this is just pertaining to edibles. I mean, I like, let's see, maybe talk to the whole native plant and how, where you get the seed from. I think that is an important consideration. But for edibles, you never know. I think sometimes we experiment with different varieties that haven't been used here before, because it's getting hotter. Like you definitely feel that, and that there might be resilient varieties that can adapt well to that, and the other ones that have been used for a long time aren't doing so well. And there are really cool projects like Working Food in Alachua County that does a lot of this, like seed documentation, variety documentation. We haven't started doing that very consistently in Miami-Dade County. I hope we do that in terms of collecting all this information about all these plants that are being traded. There was actually a group of academic researchers and practitioners that were collecting, believe it or not, collard seeds and varieties all over the Deep South for a number of years. I think they're still active, because the idea is that you're protecting the genetic diversity of this plant, but you're also potentially, there might be a time when you can't grow a certain variety of collards like in South Georgia, North Florida, and that other varieties that have been around a long time but have kind of been forgotten about. They always talk about the forgotten foods. I mean, this is why this is important, because they could be these resilient varieties that might do well in the 21st century. But, you know, in terms of dangerous to use different varieties, the only major danger I see with experimenting with different varieties is that you might invest in it and it doesn't work out, right? That's what it, but does anybody else have any, with native plants, I think that they're, I've seen studies.
Plants you want to use local germplasm. Don't really want to be a scientist who's trying to make the best possible.
Yeah. Yeah.
They do develop land races for cultivated crops. That's how you get here.
Right.
Generally, the best race or the best features for that area. You want to be that scientist, just bring all the different cultivars to the party and see what does best and try it out. It's the Seminole pumpkin I talked about. That's basically a land race from Florida. Seminoles came down here 2 years ago, and they brought that with them. It's a cousin of one from Cherry, Japan, and it does very well. I used to fail with squash all the time because I don't like to use pesticides. I don't want nutrient inputs. That one requires pesticides and nutrient inputs. I like easy gardening.
Yeah.
Delicious food too. So
yeah, that's a tried and true variety here in South Florida.
Like climb uphill. I noticed you're growing chocolate in your yard. I mean, how many candy bars?
No, I mean, and that's so when I get very jealous when I go to a place like Patch of Heaven. I'm like, really? And so those ones that I have are they are the rootstock that USDA Chapman Field, before Mars left, they were giving stuff out. I was like, sure, I'll plant it, because you know I've seen it fruiting. I mean, it grows wild. I know it doesn't really, again, like cold. Like it's another one that's 45 degrees below, 45 Fahrenheit below, it'll start withering back. But you know, I saw it all the time in southeastern Peru. In southeastern Peru, it dropped to 10 degrees Celsius. Occasionally, you'd have these friajes that would come through, but ours won't fruit. And I think that has a lot to do with like pollinators, and it's a fly that it flies that pollinate it. Additionally, I noticed at Patch of Heaven, not the average person can't do this. They cut the limestone. They have all this running water, very moist. There's a heavy moisture in the air, and I think that protects and maybe even encourages some of the, I mean, who knows? That I have not asked them. That's possible too. Yeah, it's highly possible. But I think USDA does. So USDA is also another place where they do have productive cacao. They did lose a lot of cacao in 2010 when they had that cold snap and they completely died. So now they plant a lot of their cacao is planted between a wall and a row of bananas. So if they have the cold front moves through, that it's more protected. But it's quite possible that they fertilize it. And we don't fertilize anything. I think if we use fish emulsion, that's the max I will do with any of my plants. They're not good. So they have persimmon, they have loquat. I mean, in terms of trees, they have peach. You know, they use a lot of mulch, and so yeah, they do have some input, but the mulch comes from, you know, within the garden, and so that's like, you know, drop and chop that they do, like where they cut a lot of stuff back to grow. They don't have a lot of stuff coming from off-site, so they try. No. Yeah, that's not great. Yeah, I mean, it's not good soil. I mean, it's very, compared to like when you go further north, well, so at Tallahassee, if you imagine, like Woodville sits to the southwest of Tallahassee. And so when you get closer to the coastline, it's very sandy soil, right? Not nutrient rich at all. Whereas the other side where they are in the uplands of Tallahassee, very rich red clay. You know, it's it grew a lot of cotton peanuts back in the day. So very rich soil in that part, but not where they are in Woodville, not at all. But so they grow those, yeah. So I mean, it was nice for us to kind of, I mean, I grew up in Tallahassee, but this kind of system was not around when I was growing up, and certainly organic agriculture, there might have been a few farms that were doing that. But it is a challenge when you're not using, well, like here, I mean, you have all, right? So a lot of times we're just planting on. You have to build up the soil. And once you build up the soil, the whole idea behind permaculture is that you're not adding a lot of input into it. You know, like maybe if you're really desperate, something like fish emulsion, that you don't disturb the soil, like no-till gardening.
Just an option, Arlene, like when you have your trees trimmed and they don't want them, and you can leave that mulch there if you want. And then you can, that's sort of kind of like permaculture, but not exactly like it. You're not removing the nutrients from the system.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I'm not a pure permaculture. I believe in pruning, although I'm not great about doing it. But I think you have to find a way that works for you. And if you really want fruit from certain species, that you're going to have to potentially, especially when they're young, because fruit trees, I'm sorry, they do require more input when they're young. And that's,
Farming is work.
oh yeah, yeah.
And then if you have all these trees next to each other, you just create the perfect habitat for everything that you like. The farmer is going to be staying content that that tree is going to be by itself.
But we had too long. One thing with the schools, and I don't think that they wrestle with this with the school, depending on the principal, like the rats are all around. They're not it's just like a neighborhood problem, right? Coconut Grove, we have palm rats. Yeah, they've been there a long time, but actually one case down in Homestead that the kids came back, teachers came back before like first day of school, the principal decided to forest down. And there's no rule now, like education fund is trying to work with the district where once it's planted that it's stays long term. You know, they have that, you know, Alice Waters, she had her garden in Berkeley, like those public schools. So if the principal does like it has to remain. But she had workers there cut down the entire forest. So kids were crying. It was bad. And in the case where a principal got, it was a black racer, and had the head teacher kill it right in front of the kids. And so because not everybody, they really, it takes a while to get, you know, actually, if you don't like rats, you probably shouldn't be killing snakes, right? There's a reason why you didn't encounter that person like 2010, I think they've been in the food forest program, and so they run the gamut of all kinds of situations. But for the most part, they get support from their schools. But there are a few people who, yeah.
I'll just say one last thing. If you're going to put in your yard, grow something you eat.
Yeah.
Just grow something that's gonna break. Eat it.
I totally agree. Yeah, definitely. Definitely harvest it. And if you don't want to eat it, there's probably some of your neighbors. I remember the urban tree. This was another on a guy. He got to his yard. He had locust. He had fire. He had like moringa. And I asked him, like, do you eat all this? He's like, no, but my neighbors do. They come over all the time. I'm like, your neighbors want to plant the fruit trees, and he's like, they don't want to deal with the work, right, and the mess. And that's the problem. Like some messy. Mangoes are messy. So you if you have a mango tree, you're going to have to harvest it on a regular basis. Otherwise, you are going to end up with a lot of rats. Thank you very much, everyone. And please help yourself to the booklets. Thanks.
Thank you folks on YouTube for joining us. Thank you guys. We're gonna be selling raffle tickets for about 10 minutes, all right? You got your table? All right.